Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this special event in conversation with, and celebrating, in fact, gay news and Capital Gay as we come hurtling towards the end of LGBT History Month 2023. Our thanks go to our mates at Newington Green Meeting House for putting this event on, so thanks goes to them. My name is Dan Delamotte, and sitting on my left hand should be Andrew Lumsden. Yes, there you are.
Yes, hello.
And sitting on your left hand is Graham McKerrow. So Andrew Lumsden was the founder editor of Gay News, and Graham McKerrow, don't be looking at my notes, those are my notes. And Graham McKerrow is the founder editor of Capital Gay. Before we kick off, I'm just going to give a little bit of spiel about both newspapers. And this little bit of blurb comes from the exhibition free sheet, which accompanied the exhibition that we put on in this very church last year, which celebrated the cartoons and cartoonists of both newspapers from the 1970s and 1980s. So first of all, your paper, Gay News, was a fortnightly newspaper the size of the Modern Observer and was launched on the 22nd of June 1972 in time for the first Pride March in London and lasted until issue, do you know what issue it lasted until?
250 or something?
You're wrong, it's 263. In April 1983. Gay News cost, do you remember how much it cost?
10p?
It cost 10p, which is the equivalent today to £1.40. And for your 10p, you got 25,000 words, including some by Blossom, a drag queen in the Bounds Green gay commune. You got mockery of the paedophile Jimmy Savile on the front cover, details of where to contact liberation groups, the whereabouts of the best drag acts, sexual health information, personal ads, as well as pithy and poignant cartoons. And it's important to point out, I think, that the term gay in the title of Gay News was itself defiant, new in the English language and hated throughout the 1970s by conventional print and broadcast media who wouldn't speak or print the word gay. The new use of the word gay to cover all queer people is what Gay News advocated. And then next to you is Graham McKerrow of Capital Gay, which ran from 1981 until 1995 and was started, along with Graham, by Michael Mason. And its aim was to reach thousands of people coming out and using the rapidly growing commercial pub and club scene, but who were alienated from the political movement. The paper existed to tell them about the gay scene and about the activities of the police, courts, politicians, employers, unions, religious leaders, street thugs, and the media, and what the political movement was doing in response to attacks on the community. Capital Gay was a brash campaigning weekly with a 24-hour production time so that the community could respond quickly to events. For example, when customs officers raided Gay's the Word bookshop one Tuesday in 1984, by Friday the paper had a report, photographs, and an announcement of a public meeting on the Sunday to launch a defence campaign. Capital Gay had to respond to two new threats. The first was HIV/AIDS in 1982, which required new ways of thinking, researching, and writing on healthcare, science, and the social and political consequences of the disease. The paper's coverage was detailed and fast. It was the first publication in the world to use the term HIV. The second new threat came from the Conservatives and Margaret Thatcher attacking an inalienable right to be gay in 1987, and election posters and TV broadcasts whipping up homophobia to win votes. Capital Gay was the first publication to highlight the seriousness of Section 28 the following year in 1988, with a front page headline calling it the, what did you call it?
The challenge of the century.
You did, the challenge of the century. Amid the controversy, an arson attack on Capital Gay's offices nearly closed the paper. And as the news became grimmer into the 1980s and the 1990s, Capital Gay took steps to lighten the burden on its readers through the cartoons of David Shenton, as well as the satirical column Emerald City News, and other reports, photographs, and headlines which might raise a smile. So that's a little whistle-stop bio of both papers. And I'm going to start, before we start actually talking to both of you, both of your newspapers were defiant and proud and liberatory newspapers, but it's also important to recognise the historical and social context in which they existed. And so some of the news stories that we'll be talking about today are, stories loaded with anger and emotion, these 30, 40, 50 years on. And so that's something for us all to consider. But Andrew, my first question to you then about Gay News, which is, why did you feel the need to found Gay News over 50 years ago? So what were you doing, what were you up to, and why did you decide to create Gay News?
I was a newspaper man myself. I was working for the Times newspaper, and I was in the Gay Liberation Front. And so each of us in a revolutionary movement, we make our contribution according to what our skills are. And in my case, I'd been working in national newspapers for 8 years, and I thought, well, maybe I can contribute on that front. We had a newspaper, not a newspaper, we had a periodical in Gay Liberation Front called Come Together between 1970 and 1973. And that came out episodically and was brilliant. It was full of ideas about what do we do with this, what do we do about ourselves, how do we change things, nothing to do with law reform. It was all about being proud, altering the way we'd been brought up. Well, I felt as a newspaper person that that people were not learning what was going on in the centre, the driving force of Gay Liberation Front in Europe, which was the London meetings. So people would visit us from Glasgow, from Dublin, from France, from Italy, and there was no way they could catch up with what happened next time, next week, or the week after. No news style way. So I thought we ought to have a newspaper. And Gay News was the title that I thought would be right. This was winter 1981.
71.
Sorry?
71?
71, 81, 1881. And so I went to one of the Gay Liberation Front meetings and just stood up and said, I think what we need is a newspaper. And I recommend it be called Gay News because gay was, as we've already heard, was from Dan, it was the challenging term of the moment. And it was putting 2 fingers up the nostrils of Fleet Street, where I worked, to use that term. And I said people ought to be paid to work on it, and people ought to pay for it, because it was the only way to create a good standard of product. And I think it did produce a good standard of product. So that it became, in the end, not with me running it, I disappeared into a commune and wore frocks and did things like that for quite a long time. But under a collective of Gay News, of Gay Liberation Front people, and then eventually under the editorship of Dennis Lemon, of whom many here tonight knew.
Denise Mellon.
What?
Denise Mellon.
Denise Lemon, that's right. Oddly enough, the most famous ever editor of Punch magazine, which was kind of like Private Eye, only funny, was also called Lemon, and they were not related. Under Dennis, it became the biggest selling newspaper for LGBT people ever on the planet. And it was selling about 25 to 30,000 copies a fortnight, and was bought outside Britain as well, mainly in Canada, but also in the United States. I've run dry.
Well, were you out as a gay man when you worked for the Times?
Certainly not.
No. Okay.
No, I was. one of the first things I did was have a furious row with a man who was the father of Jacob Rees-Mogg, of whom we may all have heard. Well, and I happen to know that Jacob Rees-Mogg's mother begged his father not to make her have any more children. How right she was. But his name was William Rees-Mogg, and he was editing the Times when I was working there. And he heard one evening that as a full journalist on the paper, I don't mean I was contributing, I was working there, I had offered the features editor of the paper an article about the Gay Liberation Front reaching this country. And the features editor was running it. And William Rees-Mogg came in from some meeting or other at about 11 in the evening, just before the presses started. The presses were real presses then. They were what's called hot metal. And they were huge things in the same building where we all worked. So just before they started to roll, he saw what was going to be on what we call the op-ed. That's to say, editorials one side, and then on the other side, articles. And it was going to be opposite whatever the day's editorial was. And he said, no, absolutely not. We're not running that. Find something else, anything from stock. Something about butterflies in the Norfolk Broads, anything. And so next morning, I rang his secretary and said, can I have a word with the editor, please? So she said, oh yes, certainly. Rang back, there was time. So I turned up and went into his office. So he said, yes, I wanted to see you. Well, he hadn't sent for me. And I said, yes, well, I'm very pleased to have a word. And we agreed that I could offer the article that he would not print elsewhere. So I thought, well, we need a right-wing journal for this, because it's the right wing who are the enemy. So I didn't offer it to the New Statesman. I offered it to the Spectator magazine, edited by somebody then known as Lunchtime O'Booze. And he said at once, oh yes, great, if the Times won't print it, we'll run it straight away. And just before it went to press in the Spectator magazine, a proof was sent to me. And I wrote across the top of the proof as something like, as a middle-class gay man, which wasn't on the Times one. And I just added that and put it on the front because I was so cross. And that was a come-out. So the whole newspaper, of course, knew, and one or two gay friends on the paper said, not wise, you know. But what did I care?
Very good, excellent. Well, we'll more on Andrew and gay news in a little bit, but the same question for you, Graham, then, is just over a decade later, why did you feel the need to found and edit Capital Gay?
Well, I was working at Gay News. I joined Gay News in 1980, June 1980, and that's where I met Michael, who was the news editor, Michael Mason. And at that point, Gay News was coming in for a lot of criticism for not being radical enough, not being campaigning enough. And so we were discussing ways to make it more radical, more campaigning. And we started with particularly looking at the police and exposing what the police were doing in Huddersfield, which was astonishing. I mean, they were rounding people up and raiding the clubs and going on fishing trips and collecting people's address books and so on and so forth. But we had a problem, and that was that Gay News was fortnightly, and people don't really work in fortnights, they work in weeks and months. And it had a very long lead time, which is the time between the last word being written by a journalist and it being read by a reader. So that was 11 days, and on top of that, it's a fortnightly publication. So the stuff could be very old. And I had a number of conversations with Dennis Lemon, suggesting that maybe it should be either a newspaper or a monthly magazine. And the last conversation I suggested maybe it should split in two and be both, and be Gay News as a newspaper and GN Monthly or some such as a magazine. And he just said, no, absolutely not. I don't know. I think he was frightened of, of spoiling, of it just not working. So he said no. Anyway, Michael and I carried on. We were going out for lunch, or we'd be having a drink after work, and in the way that we all do, we complain about the boss, and we say what we'd do if we we ran this place. And eventually we were talking about a different publication. And what we were talking about was a weekly newspaper with a fast turnaround that could alert the movement to what was happening, what the police were doing or whatever, and have a quick response to those things. But we also felt that there was there were more pubs and clubs opening. There was a growing commercial scene, and the movement. A lot of people in the movement were very suspicious. And very hostile towards the pubs and clubs. They thought it was all run by capitalists, and they were embarrassed to be seen. And if we saw them, they'd hide round a corner or something. It was very peculiar. And Michael and I rather liked pubs and clubs and alcohol and joints and dancing and sex. So we kind of wanted to address that. We also, the people who were using the pubs and clubs didn't like the activists. They thought the activists, caused trouble and got us a bad name and all that sort of thing. So we wanted a newspaper that said to the activists, if you're going to represent this community, you need to know who they are, you need to know what they think, you need to know where they are, and you need to like them. And we wanted to say to the people in the pubs and clubs, this is what the police are doing, this is what the politicians are doing, this is what the employers are doing, this is what the religious leaders are doing, this is what the trade unions are doing, and so forth. And so that was the thought behind Capital Gate. There were other things as well. Gay News was very, from the beginning it had been campaigning for people to come out, and quite rightly. We wanted to take a different attitude to that. We wanted to assume that people were out. We wanted to change people's attitudes towards themselves, so that whereas Gay News would quote somebody who'd been on, say, a demonstration or something, Joe said, blah, 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 it was a great turnout. We didn't want that. We wanted, Joe Smith, a window dresser from Dartford, said such and such. We wanted them to be more real, more genuinely open, where we could. Not everybody was willing to have their full name or occupation and so forth in the paper. But so that was our kind of mission. We were both at Gay News. We friends with everybody at Gay News. We loved Gay News and admired Gay News, and we were trying to design a paper that was not a competition, but was doing something else.
And Graham, you mentioned the word campaigning there. I'm interested if both of your papers were sort of proactive in the way that you reported the world. Were you encouraging campaign actions, or were you reactive to what was going on in the world around you? Andrew, first of all, what do you think about Gay News?
Where are our covers?
Right behind you. So
Right.
You stay there and I'll get you whatever you want.
Okay, there's one there about I love bashing queers.
Yes, here we go.
Here we go. All right, thank you. Can we show everybody?
Yes, we can show. I'll be the glamorous sort of...
You'll be the glamorous
There we go.
assistant.
Yeah.
There we go. That's only from issue 12 or something. So it's late 1982, late 1972. And it still has the original designs for the cover. That's an enlarged version because it was...
Well, it wasn't really that size, was it, the Gay News?
Well, I say that because on one occasion we showed that, and somebody said to me afterwards, very seriously, desperately, surely you never printed a paper. So I thought, but just mention it. This is a genuine interview with a queer basher who just tells the story about what it was like and how he enjoyed it. Well, that's what I call campaigning, because it's saying what everybody who was queer knew, and you couldn't read it or see it anywhere else except in a paper run by us. In the end, Gay News was half women and half men, and that's one of the proudest achievements, I think, of the paper. 24 staff before the end came for a financial crisis, but 24 staff, half men, half women. The women were not prepared to declare sexuality, not all of them. Some were fighting lesbians, and some just said, oh, I don't really talk about it. But we had an astonishing gender balance throughout the paper.
And what about you, Graham? Was Capital Gay a campaigning paper, or not really, just sort of reporting what was going on?
Well, it was a newspaper, so we were reporting what was going on. But, you know, every newspaper chooses how it prioritises, you know, what goes on the front page and what's the page lead and what doesn't get into the paper at all. And our response to news stories was to, I mean, somebody said we had a very strong editorial line, and I think that's a good way of putting it. We expected there to be some problems for the community in the 1980s. But, I mean, interestingly, you know, Gay News launched in June 1972, and we launched on June the 26th, 1981, both aiming for Pride Week, both with the word gay in the title, absolutely right up there. But our attitude to the news was that we would be responding to events, but then trying to provide leadership. And it wasn't leadership that would come from those people on the paper, which was a very small team. To begin with, it was only Mike and myself and an advertising manager, and that grew to then 4 people, 5 people, and I think it stopped at 6 people, and we used a lot of freelancers to get views in. But we wanted to broadcast the views of the political movement to the wider community. So we had very strong headlines and very campaigning, you know, almost slogans as on top of news stories.
Amazing. And Andrew, I think one thing which people might know a little bit about already in relation to Gay News is when you were taken to court for blasphemy. Can you please?
Could the glamorous assistant
Yes, exactly.
possibly? It's the one framed in solid gold.
And was this one this size in real life as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is a very famous story from Gay News' history, isn't it? When you were taken to court on blasphemy charges. Tell us all about that.
That's all about that. That's 1977, and Dennis Lennon came into the the art room on one occasion and said, giggling, "I've got something that'll get up the noses of the gay Christians." Now, if that had been produced in evidence when he subsequently went to the Old Bailey on trial, he would have been 10 years in the slammer. So my mention of that is only possible because A, Dennis is in a graveyard, and B, because all the legal processes were in the end exhausted. What it was a poem. Many people will know of this incident, especially some people in the front row here, whom I can just about perceive, who were quite middle-aged by the time this happened.
50 years ago.
It was a poem by a man called James Kirkup, who was a professional poet and had been teaching for years in Japan. partly he was a gay man, he was partly fed up with living in England and trying to write in England. And he wrote a poem about how a centurion was gazing with sexual longing at the hanging body of Christ, and also fantasizing about having had sex with Christ in life. And one of our cartoonists, Tony Reeves, did a brilliant, huge cartoon of Christ on the cross and centurion. Not a funny cartoon, but an illustration. And Mary Whitehouse was shown a copy of the paper. Mary Whitehouse, everybody knows, I think, who that was. Maybe not everybody. Mary Whitehouse was a campaigner, like an anti-vice campaigner or a right-wing evangelist. And she was shown a copy of Gay News some 6 months after the publication. Everybody on the paper had completely forgotten about it. It was just something that was published 6 months ago. And Mary Whitehouse's lawyers told her that there might be a prosecution for blasphemy. Well, nobody had used a prosecution for blasphemy since one in Canada, when a Roman Catholic priest was successfully prosecuted for blasphemy against another church. And then again, in something like 1931, somebody was prosecuted for blasphemy. 22, thank you, John, in 1922, prosecuted, and before that, the entire law was a very early Christian one. So she revived it, through her lawyers, she revived it, called criminal blasphemy. And Dennis was convicted of it at the Old Bailey, despite a brilliant team of lawyers. And the community raised an enormous sum of money to defend the paper. In modern terms, I have the disposal of the last fragments of this sum, so I know what it was. Some £250,000, the largest sum ever raised by the community in this country. And some unusual figures sent money, like the Monty Python comedy team from the BBC. But it was nearly all small donations from people around the country who saw this as a direct attack on the only representative voice in 1977 for LGBT people in the country. Dennis was found guilty. He was sentenced to a suspended sentence in prison, and he was personally fined some money, and the newspaper was fined money as well. And the vast sum that was raised, it was in the money of the day, something like £35,000. But if you look up measuringwealth.com, you find what it was today, and today it would be about $250,000. And the money was spent thereafter in appeal after appeal after appeal. And the last appeal was in 1983, early 83, when the European Court of Human Rights declared that Mary Whitehouse's rights had been infringed by the publication of that poem. And at that point, there was a certain amount of the money left, and I forget who we gave it to, but we gave it to, like, Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, whatever was appropriate at that time.
I think, if I may interrupt, you gave it to the Gays the Word Defence campaign.
Oh, thank you. Very good, which means it went into your pocket. Did you have a good time? Because Graham worked on the Gays the Word campaign.
I believe you were a trustee of the fund.
It was just resting in his account, just resting.
I will mention one thing about Dennis, if I may, about this, which was that he was terrified of going to jail. Absolutely, physically terrified. Because he said, what will happen, he was a very good-looking man, and he said, what will happen to me is is I'll go to jail as somebody everybody knows is a queer. And while there will be some who will treat me quite nicely because I'm relatively a celebrity, you know, when celebrities go to jail, they sometimes are not too badly treated. But there will be some who will want to gang rape. And that's what will happen to me if I go to jail. And the ruling that he had a suspended jail sentence was overturned. It was one of the very few appeals that we made that worked. And it pretty well ruined Dennis, in my view, as a close friend. The experience of that trial, he was a private sort of guy. He didn't enjoy it. Some of us might have thought, wow, I'm on stage at the Old Bailey. You know, the whole world is reporting on this. They're reporting on this in America, all over Europe. Blasphemy trial in Britain. And would have made a career out of it. He hated it. And,
were you at the court case as well? Did you have to testify?
No, I didn't have to have anything to do with it at all, and didn't. Was anybody there present in court? I do know people who were. John, here's our great friend John Lloyd. Mm-hmm. You actually went to the court.
And what was the legacy of this case, if there was one? Did it change anything?
Oh, that's very good. In the end, we won. We all won. We didn't win because the European Court said, no, Mary Whitehouse is in the right. But it was realised by those hidden people who sort of run government from kind of inside. It was realised that there could be lawsuits under that blasphemy law by any religion from crackpot to seriously large. And therefore the best thing would be to cancel the law. So it was simply dropped by Parliament. It wouldn't happen now, but then it was dropped by Parliament. I can't recall the year now. I think it was early 2000s. And Parliament relatively quietly cancelled the blasphemy law. Otherwise, we all know that the courts, if they ever opened, would be constantly filled now with cases being brought under the blasphemy law against anything and everything that's going on that's of a liberal sort.
And Andrew, I know that we're in a church, so you might have to be careful with what you say, but what was the opinion in the Gay News offices of Mary Whitehouse and her National Viewers and Listeners Association?
Oh, we loved her.
Is that your answer?
One of our cartoonists, Tony Reeves, did endless, brilliant cartoons of her with the flyaway glasses, strange glasses that she wore. And he did endless, wonderful cartoons.
Couldn't she have sued about that she's actually literally being represented in the cartoons?
Then, I wouldn't swear it now, but then you couldn't bring a lawsuit because you were being mocked in a cartoon.
Okay.
But that could change, couldn't it?
So that was the main thing I knew about Gay News was the blasphemy case. And the main thing I knew about Capital Gay, Graham, is that you coined a term which is now used sort of, it's a very used so often for historical cases, but it was you and your newspaper that first came up with the expression pretty police. Is that right?
Send for the pretty police. So, what year?
I feel like I want to play your cards right.
What year is this? This is 1984, January. So 1983, we carried a report of 60 arrests, plainclothes police in Earl's Court, arresting 60 people. And it transpired that they were agents provocateurs. They were, pretty young policemen dressed in leather jackets and torn denims hanging around outside the Colehearn, which was a leather bar in Earl's Court, and approaching men as they left the pub and saying, "Do you want to come home for sex?" And if the man said yes, they would then arrest the gay man for importuning, which was a complete lie. Now, acting as agent provocateur is not only unfair, it's illegal. Police are against the law. And so people got annoyed. Some of them were very well known. I mean, two of the policemen were so well known that they were known as the Beverly Sisters. And, so the gay humour was there, but also anger, and there was a campaign started, and it was a public meeting, and it was a very big, it was a good turnout, and they set up a permanent campaign, and they wanted a change in the law. They wanted the enforcement of the fact that police can't as agent provocateur, and they wanted to encourage people and to support people who would plead not guilty. Because what was happening was that people were being taken to the police station, they weren't allowed legal advice, they weren't allowed a phone call, and lies were then told. They were told lies like, if you plead guilty, it won't go in the newspapers, which is not true. The police have no ability to decide what goes in the newspapers. And so I reported on this meeting with the slogan, with the headline, I beg your pardon, call off the pretty police. And I put pretty police in single quotes. And it caught ever since then. Pretty police is a much friendlier phrase than agent provocateur, who wants to put that in a headline or pronounce it or spell it or anything, really. So,
almost as bad as Pretty Patel, I suppose, pretty police.
And so I'm very proud of this. This was a court case I reported on of a man who did indeed plead not guilty and went to Crown Court, and the judge said it was his word against 2 police officers, and the judge said, well, clearly somebody is lying here, because they're saying that and he's saying that, and it can't, it doesn't add up, and so there's somebody in this court is telling lies. And the jury found for the defendant, and it was a great victory. It's also a photograph I'm very proud of, because after the court case, you can't take photographs in the precincts of the court, but you can take photographs in the street. So I was a little way down the street, and I saw one of the policemen, PC Sean Quinn, and I had not a phone camera that does all the work for you, but a real camera.
Box camera.
You said stay there a second.
It was quite frightening. I was a terrible photographer, wasn't I, Andrew?
Yes.
I took a few terrible photographs of Andrew and published them. Anyway, I was shaking away and trying to focus and get the light right and all of that. And he saw me, and he decided to come and threaten me. And thank God he did. So this is a picture of him walking towards me, where he's about to say something along the lines of, if you publish a photograph of me, I'll break your fucking neck. And because he walked towards me, I waited till he was in focus instead of having to fight the camera, and took the picture. And because of the threat, I used the picture as big as I could on the front page. So that was that.
Amazing.
That was the Pretty Police.
Amazing.
And there were more people who fought it and won.
I want to now ask you both about, your paper was taken to court and the police threatening capital gay, about criminal behaviour against you both. So first of all, Andrew, your house was burgled, wasn't it, by a rival journalist or newspaper, is that right?
It wasn't me.
We can now reveal.
Now he tells me. This was 1982. And there was the Queen had a bodyguard, that Queen, had a bodyguard called Commander Trestrail, who accompanied her wherever she went, personal protection. And he was caught. I forget now exactly how he came to be caught, but he was caught out having affairs with what we today would just think was a normal transaction on Grindr or whatever, but he was effectively paying for sex with younger men. And this was exposed in the Fleet Street press. And so he had to resign at once. In later years, he was very well treated both by the police themselves and by the fringes of the royal family. In other words, they weren't buying what Fleet Street wanted done.
Well, Princess Anne's got a terrible fringe.
What?
Fringes of the royal family. Never mind.
Not as bad as Princess Anne. While this was at its height, and the Fleet Street newspapers were flaring headlines, Queen's bodyguard, sex scandal, all that kind of stuff. Two journalists, whose names I have no recollection of at all, asked if they could talk to me a bit about the case. By then, Fleet Street was reading Gay News every fortnight looking for stories. And so two guys said, could we meet you briefly for lunch or something, just to talk a bit about all this? Well, all of us were used to anything like that. We weren't going to give anybody away, nothing. But, okay, while I was having this brief lunch with them, 45 minutes or so, my flat, which was in Notting Hill Gate, the door of the flat was beaten in and down, and the flat was turmoil when I got there. So I rang the cops, the pretty police, and said, I'm one of your usual suspects, and I've just been burgled. Is that of interest to you? And they came round, and they said, this is a Fleet Street job. They said they'd seen enough of them, and they knew one when they saw it. Extraordinary force had been used to get the door of my flat down. It was a tiny flat, and then they kind of ransacked it. And what they were looking for was material about Trestrail that I had not printed in the paper, but which Fleet Street could use. And if they'd found anything like that in my flat, it would have been 40 or 50,000 quid from something like the Sun newspaper or News of the World was still in existence. So that was an insight into what can happen.
And dirty tactics, I don't think this was by a rival newspaper, but what about the arson attack that Capital Gay... That was us. That was you, wasn't it? That was Gay News. In direct response to Graham's burglary.
No wonder they put a table between us. Could we send for the fourth?
Yes, send for the...
So, section 28. I'm very proud of this. I had nothing to do with it. It was Michael who wrote this, and I think it's wonderful. And if you want to know whether we're campaigning, I think that tells you whether we're a campaigning newspaper. There was another newspaper at the time, the Pink Paper, had the same story and put it on page 6 or 7 or something. And Michael understood the importance. He knew because he'd been in GLF with Andrew, he'd been at Gay News for years, and he knew that when this happened, and he talked to certain activists. I think, was it Peter, were you one?
I
think you
story,
yeah.
on the Monday.
And you can see that it goes into, they were looking at the implications of Section 28 and got it pretty very accurate. And so this was the article that alerted everybody, really, to how serious Section 28 was going to be. And this was on Friday, is on, Friday, September the 11th, I can't see the year. December, you're quite right, December the 11th, 80,
18.
87.
87.
Yes, the end of 87.
The following morning, I got a phone call. I was in bed, and I got a phone call from Lesbian and Gay Switchboard saying your office is on fire. So you can imagine I threw some clothes on and hightailed down to the office, which was in Mount Pleasant, in one of those. It was an old factory. Some people said it had been a Victorian workhouse, but I think that was actually next door. But it was, and it had been divided up into offices, and we had 2 offices. And the fire brigade were there, and I think the police were, I'm not sure if the police were already there when I got there. And we had 2 offices, each with a door and an adjoining door. And so one of the doors to the corridor had been closed off, and a printer had been put in front of it. And we used the other door for access. And it was a very modest affair in some ways. Some paper or something like that had been pushed under the door we didn't use. And it had caught and melted the printer and melted some computers. And of course, that meant that there was tar from the melted plastic all over the office. And it looked like, the paper wouldn't come out. And that was going to be our Christmas issue. And we didn't have any insurance to cover that, so it looked like it would be the end of Capital Gay. And we sat there in this. I mean, we could sit in the other office, as it were, but it was all blackened and smelling of a fire. And I thought it was over. I rang a number of MPs. Labour MPs who were sort of sympathetic and nice about it, but couldn't really do anything. Chris Smith, the out gay MP, he came and visited. And then on the Sunday, a gay building company turned up. And you can imagine that this news had gone round the grapevine like lightning. And a gay building company turned up who advertised in the paper. Dave, I think he was called Dave. And he said, well, it's a terrible mess. We'll sort it out. And we said, well, we think it's a bit more. And they said, no, we'll sort it out. We'll have it all done. And he said, I'll have half a dozen people here within an hour. And they did. He got them there, and they sorted it out. And we said, we can't afford this. And they said, don't worry. And we were still short of... it was a privately owned paper. It wasn't a collective or anything. It was Michael and I owned half each. So we didn't want to have an appeal. But actually, the paper had been very supportive of Gays the Word during its troubles. And so some of the people at Gays the Word decided to raise money. And they raised, I think, about £3,000. And it was just enough to make the paper survive. So these 2 acts of generosity actually saved the newspaper. I mean, the building firm were working Sunday and Monday. It was our biggest issue ever, because it was the Christmas issue, and it was just... So we had to do a massive amount of work in a very short time. So our staff also got it out and just achieved an enormous amount. And I was in a state of shock. I mean, it was and nobody ever claimed, there was no graffiti or no message. We don't know who did it or why they did it, but all we know is that it was the day after we published that. And so, maybe it was somebody who didn't like one of us. Maybe it was somebody who, had a gripe about something that the paper had printed. Who knows? But it certainly was in the middle of, or at the very beginning of this Section 28. Chris Smith, there was a debate, as this says, it's going to be debated in the House of Commons the following week, and it was debated in the House of Commons, and Chris Smith told the House of Commons about the attack on the newspaper offices, and a Tory MP called Mrs. Elaine Kellett-Bowman shouted out, "Quite right too." And when she was challenged outside the House afterwards why she had said that, she said, "I am happy to affirm that there should be an intolerance of evil." And that was her view. That was her view, that arson on newspaper offices was quite right, because there should be an intolerance of evil. So that was, I mean, I think that's quite illustrative of a lot of the atmosphere in the 80s. People said and did the most astonishing things.
I think Chris Smith was the MP for here, actually, where we're sat right now.
He was the MP for Islington South and Finsbury.
It might be this. It might be this, maybe.
Your MP, Graham, at Capital Day.
He was no, our MP was Dobson in Camden. He was useless. He didn't come. He didn't answer. He didn't return phone calls. He was just hopeless.
Peter, we're going to open up to questions from the floor just in a second, but before we do, the final question that I've got is about other news stories which sort of stand out from your times at the papers. Your sort of the kind of the highlights, if that's maybe the wrong word actually, but it's kind of the major or most impactful things that you reported on. And also, Andrew, you wanted to pay homage to those that came before you as well.
Yes, I would like to do that. Lesbians were far ahead of gay men in political publishing on LGBT issues. And this is so little known, I find, that I've written down just 2 or 3 little bits about this. The most startling example of this is Urania, which was a magazine produced by Irish revolutionary women between 1916 and 1940. That's a hell of a long run. It's longer than Graham's paper lasted, it's longer than Gay News lasted, it's longer than Gay Noise lasted. We have a representative, as it were, of Gay Noise here. Urania, I think this is wonderful. It was the work of the sister of Countess Markowitz. For those who know who I mean, Constance Gore Booth, born in London, raised in County Sligo, became an Irish revolutionary, actually drew her Colt gun and fired at British soldiers during the 1916 Easter Rising, would have been hanged like the men if she hadn't been a woman, and was set to have an enormous long prison sentence. Her sister was a lesbian, that's Eva Gore Booth, and she with her partner Ethel, they decided that part of a revolution had to be imagining a future where the genders didn't behave the way they traditionally did in these islands at that time. Ireland and Britain were locked in mortal struggle. Urania, I thought I would just mention that it was published in Bombay because it was safer to have it published in India, and then it was sent from India to here. It was published every couple of months, most of the time. Every issue began with a sentence. There are no men or women, apostrophes, there are no men, with apostrophes, and no women, with apostrophes, in Urania. So it was a declaration of non-binary conduct. And what delights me about this is I'd never did this until just before this evening. I thought, why was it called Urania? It's not the nicest sound. It sounds a bit urinogenital, you know. And they chose perfectly. Urania was a little known today, ancient Greek goddess. She was the goddess of astronomy, the stars, the globe, and the compass. So in every way, she's spot on for showing the future. Later on, just a couple of other ones for those who don't know. There was Arena 3, which was published by Minorities Research Group, lesbians who met in Carnaby Street for years. And that was published between 1964 and 1971. So that was published well before Gay News appeared, and had about 600 subscribers. And then when that was closed by the owner, that was Esme Langley was the owner of it. Jackie Forster, a famous name in lesbian history, Jackie Forster started Sappho. And Sappho started up just after Gay News started up, 1972 to 1981. I knew about Arena 3 and I knew about Sappho when I suggested that we invent a newspaper, which is the Gay News one. But I had no idea about the Irish revolutionary women who for 30 years ran a paper for, not a newspaper, but an opinion and information paper. And then just finally, the world's first lesbian magazine was weekly, or monthly, or fortnightly, and it was called Defreundin, and Freundin means girlfriend. So had it been published in English, it would have been called The Girlfriend. And probably about 10,000 copies were being distributed for as long as it lasted. 1924 until Hitler took over Germany in 1933. It included a special insert for trans people. So there we are.
And Andrew, I'm going to let you stew over the other question I asked you, which was your other memories of your time at Gay News and major news stories that stand out. And while you think about that, I'm going to ask that exact question to Graham.
Well, I suppose I have to choose a story that is sort of emblematic of other stories, and that is one that we published in 1986 and got us a mention in the Oxford English Dictionary for the first use of the term HIV. And I only mention that particular story because I think it is a tribute to how on the ball we were with our coverage of AIDS. Because when I say it's the first mention, that's not just beating the mainstream press, but it's beating the medical press and it's beating the press all around the world. So, and that is because we took an early decision. We'd been reporting in a small way on what was happening in America, where AIDS was happening first. And it was clear that it was going to come here and that it was going to be big, so we had to cover it right from the very earliest stages. And in fact, I went to New York and I spoke to an AIDS activist, a very remarkably early AIDS activist, an astonishing man called David Summers, who was a cabaret performer. And he got AIDS and he decided to tell the world. And there was no act up, there was nobody doing it, and he went on television and he stormed into the mayor's office, and anyway we spent a long time discussing all the different aspects, and I asked him what were the main successes and failures of the American gay press on coverage of AIDS, and he said they didn't have any successes, they only had failures, and that was that they'd done far too little, far too late. And so I thought, well, that reinforces my feeling that we have to not make that mistake. So we did a lot. We did a lot to the extent that some people called the paper capital AIDS and things as an insult, which was like water off a duck's back. I don't care. But we had, as I said earlier, we had a small team of people on paper, but we used a lot of people, freelancers, some of them in this room, and we had to look at AIDS had so many different implications. So obviously there were medical, and there were social consequences, but there was political and trying to. And I'm not a doctor or a scientist, and one had to understand the immune system and retroviruses, and I understood as much as I could, but really my job was to understand enough to commission the right people to write the right stuff. And people would come to me, and Peter Thatcher would come and say, I want to write about Ayurvedic medicine. And I would go, okay, Peter. And, when you've got a very frightening illness that, for which there is no cure, it's very confusing, and it's very frightening personally as well as in the newspaper. I'm not just a journalist, I am a homosexual. And, I was a gay man in London, and my friends were getting ill and dying, and my lover got HIV, and in fact, we were a part of a research project. And we were going in, I can't remember, once a month or every 3 months or something, and they were examining our bodies and taking blood samples, and when they discovered the virus, what we didn't know was that they went and tested all the samples that we left, and they were able to say, they then called my partner in and said, you have, it was called HTLV3 then, you have the virus, and sent him away with no counselling or anything like that. And so we assumed that I would also be positive. So I kind of had a few weeks, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, for that sort of information to settle in. So when I was called in, I was ready to hear that information. And he said, you don't have the virus. Goodbye. So I went away. And about a year or two later, we were what would then be, it became called a serodiscordant couple. And it has its own psychological problems, its own problems to do with, how, he didn't want to give it to me, I didn't want to get it, what do you do? What do you do with regard to sex or to toothbrushes or whatever? So we're living with this private stuff as well as having to react in public. And it was incredibly stressful for everybody on the paper. It was very stressful for everybody in London or every gay man. But we decided to just have as much publicity as we can. We wanted to make sure that there was a newspaper in New York that had the slogan, the best way to stay well is to stay well informed. And that was really our attitude. We didn't use that slogan, but our attitude was that we're only going to be able to help people by just giving them the information. And there were all sorts of issues that came up about should you take the test, for the virus or not? Because what's the point of taking a test for a virus if there's no treatment? And, some people thought that it was a good idea because it might encourage people to be more careful with their partners. Other people thought that it might even have the opposite effect. But certainly people could lose jobs. People were firebombed out of their homes. People, you could have difficulty getting insurance. So we had to present issues like that, issues like blood donations, all sorts of issues. Really difficult for me, really difficult for us, really difficult for the community. And so we wrote a lot. And I do think it's extraordinary that a tiny little newspaper of 6 full-time people is in the OED for the first use of HIV. And I think that's a tribute to... I'm very proud. I'm very proud of what we did.
Andrew, same question to you then. What other news stories or things that you covered sort of stand out from your time at Gay News?
I'll be very, very brief because there might be people who want to say things. So for me, I would simply choose a visual, something visual, which is Dennis Lemon, before he became editor of Gay News, but when he was part of the collective. Dennis Lemon is tall, rangy character, a bit like an angle-poised lamp, you know, with a very handsome face stuck on the top of it. Outside the Coleherne pub in Earl's Court, which was then famous for, as a leather bar resort, you know, leather pub. He was standing outside and he was shouting at the Coleherne and anybody who could hear him from inside. And the reason he was doing that was because the Coleherne was totally hostile to the newspaper Gay News. It was a principal LGBT, well not LGBT, really gay men's pub in London, and it wouldn't allow anyone to sell Gay News within its premises. And so he was outside, so that's the mixture which Graham has been describing, where it's the personal. Dennis was outraged. This was one of his favourite pubs. The personal, the political, because the gay managers, not the owners of the pub, but the gay managers of the pub, were refusing to let him or any of the collective for Gay News go in there and offer the paper for sale.
Why?
Because Gay News was regarded as upsetting the apple cart, you know. Fundamentally, the Coleherne pub was as respectable as Mary Whitehouse. The guys in leather inside were nearly all interior decorators. And they would be, you go and stand next to somebody in a mule cap and a glorious leather outfit, and you'd overhear them saying, well, I went into John Lewis and I couldn't find the fabric.
There we go, excellent. We do have time for a few comments or questions from the floor. So yeah, we're gonna, maybe if there's more than one, we'll see if we can take them in a group. So we're gonna go 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, okay? Let's see if you might not need the mic, but let's...
I'm American.
You're American.
So I mean, I'll start by saying I don't know if this is because I'm foreign, but I have never heard of any of the lesbian publications that you mentioned. And as you were talking, as you mentioned, you know, it was a very good gender mix in the staff and all. I've literally never heard that as part of, you know, my community history. Even in talking about the HIV/AIDS crisis, obviously gay men would have gone through the brunt of it emotionally, but I've been told that, you know, lesbians did a lot of the work and things like that.
Yes.
However, in It's a Sin, which is, you know, the recent television adaptation that now a lot of people my generation are familiar with as the story of that, there wasn't any lesbian representation in that. And it's like I feel like I'm kind of caught between some people who tell me one version of history, and then others like yourselves who have lived it and been in the publications and watched as the news has come out. So I'm just kind of curious, why do you think, for example, you know, there's, well, at least one lesbian bar in London plus question mark, right? There's a few queer bars and things. Or there's not many anywhere else in the UK outside of, I've heard there's one in Manchester, again, foreign. So yeah, that's about as much as I know. But I'm just quite curious about, it sort of seems like the communities have always sort of existed in parallel, not always running together. And then I always hear about, no, there were other groups that did this first, other groups who did more work, people who did this and that, you know, Lisa Power getting involved with Stonewall and the Terrence Higgins Trust and all of that. I'm just curious about your perspectives. Long-winded, sorry.
So, lesbian representation and activism. Andrew, you kind of kicked us off with with those lesbian pioneers that went before you. Any thoughts on that question other than that?
Well, I just so treasure what you said about lesbians stepping forward when the men were falling ill, because we know that it was lesbians again and again, both in the United States and here, who stepped forward absolutely without benefit to themselves, because the men, us men, why no lesbian bars? Well, not enough of them. Why not enough lesbian venues in this capital city or any other big city? Because the men have the money. It's just that. The men have always had the money. And you can have a rich lesbian. I've known plenty of rich lesbians. In America, in California, they were called lipstick lesbians. And I once went to a party, and you never saw such glamour, except in photographs of an Oscar ceremony. And it was a party of about 60 lesbians who'd flown in. They were so well off, they'd flown in from all around the United States, and they were dressed to kill, and they were indeed wearing lipstick and the whole lot.
What were you doing there?
Well, I got my way in by borrowing a Chanel frock. No, what happened was with my boyfriend, a Californian boyfriend, we knew one of the women very, very well, and she just said, look, we're not inviting any bloody men, but you're not really men. So why don't you two come along for a while, but don't stay for very long. So we didn't.
Well, there we go. There's an anecdote you weren't expecting to hear as your answer there. Excellent. Anything to add on that, Graham, or shall we?
I would like to talk about briefly what you said about it's a sin and that is that I'm very pleased with the effect that it's a sin had. But the story itself, I thought, was complete rubbish. Now, I have to acknowledge maybe it's the writer's story, so it may not be as complete rubbish as I think it is, but it's not the story that I saw, because what that was a lot of dizzy queens not knowing what to do, and a straight woman telling them to pull their socks up and whip things out. And that's not what happened. What happened was that the gay community rallied around in the most astonishing way. That the gay men who set up the Terence Higgins Trust, it was the Gay Medical Association that came out with the first advice, it was the gay press that were trying to educate people, it was gay men who were doing everything, and the only community that supported us was the lesbian community. And there was no other, that's not to say every lesbian, and it's not to say there was no individual from another community, but the only community that stood by us as a community is the lesbian community, and we are forever being protected.
Absolutely. Who was the number two? Where was number two? You don't need the mic either, so let's yeah.
Well, I was just going to say how fabulous it was to listen to you, but I'd also like to just comment that I think that Capital Gay and the support that it gave to London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard who was there as a sponsor across its front thing, even when times were hard for you, was really wonderful and really supportive. And I just think you really do need to look forward to that.
And I should have mentioned Switchboard when I was mentioning organisations that did a lot on AIDS. Switchboard was right up there just from receiving the calls, having to educate your volunteers and therapy walks and call the first seminar on the subject. So again, it was our community. It wasn't the government. The government were hopeless.
And who was?
We had a front page. We had a front page editorial in 1985 saying 4 wasted years was the headline, and it was just saying the government had done enough.
Who was on line 3? Who was our third caller? I can't remember. Yes. Do you need the mic? Do you think, or can you shout? I'm going to give you the mic, just to be polite.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the distinctions, differences in perspective and approach of the two newspapers. And I'm also thinking particularly about the approach towards Section 28. So this headline that you showed us, that came out not too long after a competitor newspaper began, the Pink paper. I wonder, what were the differences between the approaches of the Pink Paper and Capital Gay towards Section 28 in terms of reporting it? And what might have been the approach of Gay News that was distinctive had Gay News been around in 87?
Who wants to kick off on that one? Andrew?
Had Section 28 been in, say, 1976, before the blasphemy trial, so before all that disruption, then we would have run with it and run with it. What was happening on Gay News was that all over the print business in Britain, there were self-aware gay men, principally gay men, for what I'm describing, who were writing articles for every leading newspaper, every leading magazine, and they could not be out. So if they reviewed an exhibition by Lucian Freud or by or David Hockney, they could not comment as an out gay person. But in Gay News, for the first time, they could. So what would have happened with Section 28, had it been about 1976, is that Gay News, for issue after issue after issue, there would have been people from all the different occupations affected who would have been writing and contributing not only news stories, but opinions, long articles, because the paper carried very long articles.
Graham, anything to add to that?
I'm not really an expert on the Pink Paper, but as I say, it missed it originally, but then it did pick up and it was campaigning. As far as Capital Gay was concerned, we were doing everything to get as many people to protest as possible, and that meant getting people to go on marches. So we were front page in, the day before or the week before a march that was going to happen, and the marches got bigger and bigger. So that we had initially, I think it was 8,500 on the march in London, which was regarded as huge, and then there were 20,000 on the march in Manchester against Section 28, and then there was 29,000 on a march, another march in London. And so we would have a whole page, because it went through the House of Commons really quickly. It was then going to the House of Lords. We had to lobby the House of Lords. Well, how the fuck do you lobby the House of Lords? Do you know what I mean? They were hereditaries then. We had some appointees, but so we had to have a whole page saying how to lobby the House of Lords. So that was, as far as we were concerned, the Capital Gay was a tool to inform, to keep people up to date, and to urge them to do whatever they could to protest. There was also a meeting of gay and straight press at Heaven, where, amongst other people, was Peter Mandelson. I said something rude about Neil Kinnock, and he nearly chopped my head off. And that resulted in the independent newspaper, which has been recently launched, and it became the newspaper, the mainstream newspaper with the greatest cachet. And so we had a full page advert in that was headlined "A Sense of Alarm," wasn't it? Signed by lots of famous people. So we were involved in that. I think, the paper was there to do whatever the movement felt was the way forward.
Great, can we go, and then we've got 4 and 5, so do you need the mic, Peter, are you all right?
No, I'd like to tell a quick story about Capital Gay and the way it operated, and then I'd like to ask Andrew a question. That's the order. Graham, do you remember, I think it was Halloween 1982, 1981, Heaven.
81.
A very new paper, and Heaven had the show, a floor show, which was basically a satanic rape scene, which the
Exactly
paper
so.
covered. And I was the paper boy for the paper at the time, delivering around. And I came into the office afterwards absolutely outraged and demanded that you denounce this show in an editorial and things. And you said, no, we'll do it a different way. And what they did was they ran 2 weeks of 4-page spreads about male rape. And no other paper had covered that before. And out of that came the organisation Survivors, which I think is still going under a different name. And basically nobody had even considered that it existed as a phenomenon until you did that. And it was so much more constructive than just instead of getting on your high horse and denouncing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I rang up the people who ran the club and the people who did the cabaret, and I said, you know, what are you doing having rape as a cabaret entertainment? And they said, well, men don't get raped. And I said, yes, they do. And they said, no, they don't. And they said, well, where's the evidence? So I didn't have any evidence. So I rang round all the switchboard and all the sort of organisations that might have encountered it, and they had very little evidence. And I rang the women's rape organisations, and they not only said that they didn't know anything about men getting raped, they wouldn't help a man who was raped. And so I decided that the thing was to just put it on the grapevine. And so everybody who came into the Capital Gay office, whether they were placing a small ad or a display ad or coming in with a news story, I said, have you ever, or do you know anyone who's been raped or sexually assaulted in any way? And a lot of people came forward, and nobody would have their name in the paper, nobody would have their photograph. So we had 3 pages, just words, and I called it Male Rape. And it's a name that stuck. I thought it wouldn't. I thought it was too. I thought all rape is really done by men, so it's all, in a sense, male rape. I thought someone would come up with a better name, but they haven't.
And your question to Andrew, yeah.
I wanted to ask Andrew about the demise of gay news, how it ended, because you were very involved in the efforts to try and save it and to get the staff buyout of the paper. But by that stage, it was actually wholly owned by Dennis Lerman, I believe, and it wasn't happening. And I mean, I can remember running benefits for the staff as well, and you going to a CHE conference and getting a huge amount of support. And indeed, and I wrote a wonderful book, which ought to be back in print, called Title Fight, about the whole campaign. Would you elaborate? Tell the story.
Yes, and thank you, Peter, for all you did at that time. There was always a split in gay news between its origins in the Gay Liberation Front and therefore ideas that it should be collectively run, and the fact that again and again in LGBT organisations, one individual in due course is just the right person to carry the whole project forward. And Dennis Lemon was the person who had the drive and the ambition to carry forward gay news. And as part of that, he decided that he needed not only to be for it to be agreed that he'd be called editor, which had not been the case in the early months, but also in due course he asked around saying, I need to own this paper in order to make sure that what I say goes. So he became more authoritarian. And as he did that, there remained a simmering discontent amongst many of the lesbians and the gay men who worked on the paper. And he came to be regarded as tyrannical by a lot of people. He had no real tyrant powers, but what he did have was the business. And it was making very, very good money at one time after the blasphemy trial. The absurd consequence a ludicrous consequence of the blasphemy trial was that it became far more profitable and had a far higher circulation. And Dennis, as the sole proprietor, was earning very well. I don't know what he was making, but for the first time in his life he was able to buy a flat round the corner from here, and to lead a fairly luxurious lifestyle with a very nice car, for instance. But after the consequence of the blasphemy trial being, he was so unnerved that he began to think, what I want to do is get out of all this, and to do that I need a retirement pot. So I want, privately, I'll start finding somebody to buy it. And so he set out, and the first person he asked that I know of was Tony Elliott, who published, and perhaps still does, Time Out. And they negotiated for quite some time. But in the end, that fell through. And more or less floundering around, Dennis trying to find some way of realizing the capital that the income represented. His high income from the paper can be transposed into a capital sum. This is what the income you'd get off a capital sum, up in the 100,000 area or something like that. And he found a way around it, because an individual from Campaign for Homosexual Equality, who died just a few months ago, he stepped forward with a proposal to do a thing called a management buyout. Now, nobody will live long enough to be interested in what a management buyout is. And it really more or less passed over the head of the working staff there until they realized the consequences. And the consequence was that this individual became the owner in place of Dennis and was buying the paper out of its future income. And at that point, the internal stresses began to break open. And one of the ways they broke open was, one of the last things that Dennis did was, as editor, was to accept a suggestion I put to him that the invisibility of lesbians being the awful strain under which lesbians tended to live, that we should have a page called The Visible Lesbian. And he agreed with that suggestion. And if we were to have such a page, eventually it became 2 pages, handed over, obviously, to the lesbians on staff and any of their friends that they trusted. So that was anybody from a typesetter. It wasn't just people who are writers, you know. And they produced those pages. And I think I can say that more or less the centre of revolt was the Visible Lesbian pages on the paper. So there we go again, Irish revolutionaries.
And we might not have time to hear your comments on this, but the final comment, I think, did you want to speak, John? Or was it you, Ian? Go on, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick thing. Quick thing about the Calder. Brian Derbyshire, otherwise known as Beryl. This is the SM leather bar in Earl's Court. It was harassed by the police quite severely, just outside the Calder and in the cemetery next door where people went cruising. Did Gay News actually, or Capital Gay actually cover all of that? I don't know if they did or not.
Yes, it was Wharfdale Street behind the pub. And yes, both newspapers covered that extensively.
There we go.
One of the Gay News staff was arrested in the cemeteries. There was some first-hand experience.
In fact, it's a miracle Graham and I didn't get arrested there.
On that, there's a green just outside for us to all go cruising after this. It just leaves me to hugely thank both Andrew Lumsden of Gay News and Graham McKerrow of Capital Gay. office. And And because I'm a softie, go on then, what is...
I just wanted to bind the two papers together because my favourite headline of any newspaper ever was in Gay News, but it was written by Michael Mason the other day, and it was Gay Sex Splits Bishops.
Well, thank you for chipping in on that. There we go, thank you.
I attended the trial of Gay News from beginning to end until a conviction. And we decided to set up a National Gay News Defence Committee, and we organised 2 large marches in London at separate times. The trial was a fit-up. The defendant was not allowed to put forward, that's Dennis Lemon and Gay News, they were not allowed to put forward a fair defence. They were not allowed to put a mental element into it. If it was obscene publications, it would have had a literary merit defence, but it was a strict liability defence. The defendant and the newspaper did not have a fair trial. It went the jury, it was a jury trial, and they didn't hear 90% of the case. It was held, most of it was held in the absence of the jury. And it went to the Court of Appeal, it went to the House of Lords and the European Court of Human Rights, and they upheld the right not to have a guilty mind defence. The European Court of Human Rights said religion trumps all other rights. The only right in the ECHR was the right to religious freedom. Everything else doesn't matter. Everything else doesn't matter, only ECHR. So the trial went that far. We started National Gay News Defence Committee. We held the first large LGBT demonstration in history in the many of thousands. And before that, we had demonstrations in the King's Road. We picketed Mary Whitehouse's home. I rang her bell and we started singing A Gay in a Manger. And Jesus Wants Me for a Bum Boy. We did all number of things like that. And what more can I say? It's just...